So let me turn to the panel, and let me start maybe by asking Professor Miles Korak about this report. Ambar talked about income mobility, and he hinted at the relationship between educational mobility and income mobility. The report, a big part of it does focus on education, and I want to ask you a two-part question. First, how well does educational mobility correlate with income mobility? We have a sense that it's a prerequisite, but is it enough? And second, if we are talking about educational mobility, why do we care about relative educational mobility? Should we care just about absolute educational mobility, or is relative also important, and why?
Oh, good. Thank you. And congratulations to the authors of the report. As you suggested, this is a report that goes to 300 pages. And a big chunk of it is dealing with educational mobility. I think they document very clearly that there's a strong relationship between education mobility and intergenerational income mobility. I think one of the graphs that Roy showed a correlation of around 0.5, and that's a pretty strong. That's not to say that education is a guarantee to economic success, but it is certainly a gateway, a very important gateway. And we care about it, I think, both for intrinsic and extrinsic reasons. But maybe I could just sort of pause on one part of the concluding section of the report that sort of stuck with me. The report seems to speak very clearly to the fundamental aspirations of citizens. What do all parents want? In some deep way, they want hope, they want progress, they want their children to live in a better space. And absolute mobility speaks to that. My children are doing better than I am. Absolute mobility in education clearly is an important part of that. Now, as readers of the report, I caught myself a couple of times, we always have to be careful. Everything here is in comparison to starting points. So we're not necessarily talking about what the absolute level of education is, which growth theorists and macroeconomists focus on, and that's terribly important. But relative to the education level of parents, have children made progress? And in this intrinsic way, it speaks to what I value and what I want. Okay? So in that sense, I think the report is, when it speaks to absolute mobility, is speaking to a fundamental concern of citizens. What do children want? Well, they perhaps have a different perspective. If you're a parent of a teenager, you appreciate that not all of their preferences line up with yours. But they certainly want to see themselves making progress beyond and above what their parents did, but they also want their full talents and energies recognized. They want a place in their hierarchy that is independent of their starting point, that reflects their energies, their talents. And hence the intrinsic importance of relative mobility in that sense. But as the very nice presentation also illustrated, there's a lot of drivers here, and it's not just the structure of the education system that matters, but also the structure of labor markets. And I was struck by the comment you made for some of the MENA countries. Maybe there is a real social challenge for countries that have fulfilled that educational opportunity policy challenge, telling their citizens that they can go off and get all the education that their talents and energies merit, but then not offer opportunities in the labor market. If the allocation of jobs remains networked, remains unfair in some fundamental sense, whereas you've created all of these aspirations, maybe these two things come together and raise the risk of conflict and a social fabric that begins to be stretched.
I think that's a very important point, and I'm going to come back to that point in a second.
All right.
But before we move to the labor market, I just want to dwell a little bit on the educational side. And one way I think you put it very very powerfully, and speaking of aspirations of parents for their children in terms of better chances and their own aspirations of children themselves. One sort of simplified way of summarizing what you said is educational mobility, absolute and relative, does not guarantee intergenerational income mobility, but it's almost a prerequisite. It's very hard to imagine income mobility without that.
I think the authors of the report would agree with that. Education mobility is not the only aspect of human capital, but it is certainly a fundamental one. Yeah.
So, Rebecca, if I'm going to turn to you, if we're talking about educational mobility, and it is the finding that absolute mobility has stalled in many parts of the world, particularly in developing countries. I mean, it's striking. It's almost counterintuitive to what we think is going on in terms of greater access. And there are some positive, there's a story of variation, so there's a lot of mobility in East Asia. There seems to be a closing gender gap. But are some of the reasons for that inside the educational system? I mean, what is it, what can the educational system itself do in terms of addressing that problem? And then we can talk about what everything else that also needs to happen. But if we just look at the educational system first, what's your view?
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on what we should do within the education system to address this. But Anna, can I come back to that? Because I first have a question based on what you just said, that it seems counterintuitive, the findings, that education mobility has stalled, and yet we've been telling ourselves and thinking and tracking that we've had a lot of educational progress with the Millennium Development Goals, et cetera. So if I may, I have a question for Ambar and Roy first, and then I'm happy to come back to education policies. I thought the report was super interesting. I think it's really interesting to highlight the sort of economic mobility, social mobility component. It's a good angle to bring to the conversation, particularly in the education sector. We don't talk about it that much. We talk about sort of the last mile, those we can't reach. So I really liked that. But I noticed your data set, and maybe I missed something, it stops at the people born in 1980. Is that correct? Yeah. Right. So they would have gone through school and more or less, depending on if they start on time, finished right before the year 2000. Yeah. And so I pulled, right before coming down, I pulled the gross enrollment ratios at primary and secondary level just for sub-Saharan Africa, because that was really light blue. Yeah. And I'm sure you've looked at this, but it really is after the year 2000 that the massive uptick in enrollment starts, right, in sub-Saharan Africa. Let's just take secondary level. It's basically more or less the same gross enrollment ratios in sub-Saharan Africa. In 1980, it's 18%, 1990, it's 23%, in 2000, it's 26%. Fast forward 15 years of the MDGs, where you really have big policy juice to get kids into school, it's 42%. Yeah. So a big uptick. Same sort of picture with primary gross enrollment rates. So I could imagine if you had a bigger data set and looked at the generations born after 1980, I would imagine that those light blue countries would be colored darker blue. So I'm sure you've looked at this. I'm sure you've thought about it. I'd love to hear your answer, because the big message seems either a bit misleading or I'm curious about that.
Yeah, why don't you answer that, and then
then
I'm not going to let Rebecca off the hook.
Yes,
we're going to come back to educational policies, and then I want to go.
But I'm really curious about this.
Part.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. The reason why we didn't measure absolute or relative mobility for the generation beyond the 1980s, because they wouldn't be old enough for their education to be completed by the time the surveys came. So we have the data, we have the enrollment data, we stop at 1980s because these are people who would have finished their education. Right. But having said that, because of the reason what you just said, so we looked at the data for people who may not have finished their education yet. So we can't measure their absolute and relative mobility in the same way, but we can measure something else.
Right.
And we can do predictions. And based on the predictions, what we find is that for sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, absolute mobility under reasonable assumptions is going to go up because of this reason.
Okay.
It's going to go up to the extent that it's going to approach the developing economy average in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not going to catch up with it completely.
Yeah.
South Asia is going to be, it's going to be ahead of the developing economy average. So that's on absolute mobility, using these assumptions. But on relative mobility, things don't improve, because on relative mobility, what we do is that we take a proxy measure, and then we see what is, and then we measure relative mobility in that proxy measure. And there, the gaps are between the rich and poor and so on, or more educated, they remain. So in fact, we see a very similar patterns of gaps between for 12 to 15-year-olds in sub-Saharan Africa, which is very similar to what we see for people who have completed their education, the 1980s generation. So therefore, we're comfortable with the message to say that, look, mobility not only has it stalled, but even if you look ahead, people who are growing up now, the relative mobility,
not absolute mobility.
Yeah, for absolute mobility, it's slightly better, but again, it's not something which is, which shows major progress in Africa.
Okay.
So I think,
sorry.
So I think one of the risks, I mean, I'm glad you made the point about the data, because it is a question that comes up a lot, but things must have been getting better in the last 20 years. But I think one of the messages I took away from the report is, let's not be too complacent about the success that has been achieved, because certainly relative mobility doesn't look very successful almost anywhere. And actually that graph showed that except for Scandinavia, everybody else looks pretty bad, no matter how rich the country is. And I think there's a risk of complacency. And that's why I wanted you to talk about to what extent, there are many factors that play into it, but to what extent is the education system itself part of the problem?
So I would point to, there's been a lot of work on this, of course, including from great people inside the World Bank. So I would point to the latest World Development Report that focused on education, and one of their big messages is that it's fine to look at attainment. You said earlier, like everyone measures attainment. In fact, there's lots of people who measure learning globally, and we need to align sort of the incentives within education systems to improve learning. And that means a lot of different things. There's another interesting report that just came out, again from World Bank colleagues, looking at sub-Saharan Africa, called Facing Forward. And again, they point to the same question of learning. So you can get kids into school, but they don't necessarily learn well for lots of reasons. And there's some, light statistics around this, just to amplify it for folks who might not be familiar with this problem. You have, this is from the Facing Forward report that some of your World Bank colleagues put together. In a bunch of sub-Saharan African countries, we'll stick with sub-Saharan Africa because they were so light blue, 3/4 of second graders couldn't count to 100. And that's in second grade. They just didn't even know basic numbers past. They could get up to 80 or something. They couldn't answer a simple question. 50 to 80% of second graders couldn't answer one simple question based on a very simple text. So attainment isn't the same as actually learning skills. And if you don't master basic skills in the early years, you are not going to continue on. So access and quality are absolutely tied together. And there's lots of things, and the education sector spends a lot of time thinking about how do you make this better. And one of the, I'll point to two more reports that I think, if people are interested in diving into the education policy realm, these are really good sources in addition to the ones I mentioned. There is a global effort called the Education Commission, which was a big global task force and really tried to set out sort of a big agenda for quote unquote a learning generation. How do we really change the trajectory, which is quite a slow pace of change, which is I think your point, Anna. And they had sort of 4 big transformations. One is performance, like education systems have to do a lot better with what they're delivering today. They have to be a lot more efficient. And there's very basic things. And this gets to why you have still these deep inequalities. Basic things like mother tongue instruction. Most kids, again, I'm sticking with sub-Saharan Africa because that was kind of one of the outliers in the report. Most kids in sub-Saharan Africa and many other developing countries are not taught to read in the language they speak at home. All the evidence says this is not going to help kids, and they're likely going to drop out. So quick policy change, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes textbooks, imminently doable, not a problem, should be invested in. other pieces, again, around performance, is alignment within the education system. All of the reports that I just mentioned, the WDR, the Facing Forward, the Education Commission report, talk about the need to align education systems around learning goals, not just attainment and attendance and enrollment goals. So assessing learning is really important. And there's lots of ways to do it, and one should do it, but you can't just assess learning. You have to align three big things: your curriculum, what you're telling teachers to teach and what students are supposed to learn has to line up with how you're training teachers, and has to line up with how you're measuring learning. Most countries in the world tackle one of those and not the other two. And so there's an important alignment exercise. So that's performance. The other three I think are important to note. Innovation is really needed, and I'm going to come back to that. And then there's financing, which was already discussed, and you made a really good point. And then there's this idea of progressive universalism, basically send money and effort and attention to the areas that are the most marginalized, for the most marginalized kids first, and then expand out. I want to take a pause on innovation, because I think this is an area that could really help us with this question of particularly relative mobility. And some of the work we've been doing here at the Center for Universal Education is really diving deep on that sort of second transformation that the Education Commission report puts forward and says, which basically is that you can do all you can in improving education performance, but you won't actually get to where you want to be, which is massively increased relative mobility and much higher standards, if you don't do things differently. Or you certainly, you have to do it quicker. And so some of the research that we've been doing is looking at education innovations around the globe. We've surveyed 3,000 in 150 plus countries, and really try to focus on those that are, in our words, the most leapfroggy, the ones that can massively accelerate progress. And there's lots of things you can do with blended learning, which is how you bring in technology with teachers. There's a huge teacher gap. So how you can fill that teacher gap, again, with technology and community members. There's a whole bunch of, a suite of sort of sets of innovations that could actually rapidly accelerate progress. So I think those are the types of things that could help.
That's all very encouraging. And as you said, I think there is a lot of momentum to focus on quality, focus on learning. I'm a labor economist by training. I suspect, Miles, that you're also a labor economist originally. And of course, I'm left with this big question in my mind, which is, okay, we can improve quality, we can improve performance in the educational system. The return to that may be very low, both in terms of growth and mobility, if your labor markets aren't functioning well. And so I want to come back to the point that you raised, and particularly refer to that graph that Ambar put out that shows their outliers. Colombia, high absolute educational mobility, very persistent income inequality and low mobility. And particularly in developing countries where you have segmented labor markets, you've got big informal sectors, you perhaps have family connections that matter, how do we tackle those? How do it's one thing to say, let's get your labor markets to function better, but in practice, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about in terms of making the labor market more fair and that playing field more even? And let me start maybe with you, or Ambar, you can jump in as you want.
Well, let me go, but please do jump in, because we're talking about 140 countries.
Well, let's just talk about one. You pick one that you want to talk about.
Well, maybe what I can do is give people a sense of what the underlying drivers are and how they overlap. And you can see that this report, this building, had a scaffolding, and that scaffolding has a certain theoretical perspective. And they've taken the scaffolding down, but it's still embedded in the structure. And education is not the only dimension of human capital. So there's a lot of importance certainly attached to health as well, and some of that is mentioned, and the start in life. Migration is an aspect of human capital as well. And that relates to labor markets. The idea of I think where you see very high intergenerational elasticities that really struck me as astounding, 0.8, and in some countries even 1. So if the intergenerational earnings elasticity is 1, it means that across the generations, inequality is going to get worse and worse and worse. And if we're in a situation like that with, I guess, maybe half a dozen or more countries, there are just some basic barriers in the labor market associated probably with ethnicity, national origin. So you think of Aboriginal peoples versus the mainstream in some countries, overt discrimination. Those kinds of things in and of themselves should be eliminated regardless of the intrinsic value of those. So I think that would be sort of your first direction for policy. If labor market is driven by ethnicity rather than talent, then you've got severe problems. And I don't see how intergenerational elasticities of 0.8 or higher, 0.6 or higher, exist without those kinds of barriers and can be sustained and changed without breaking down those fundamental barriers. I don't know, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I mean, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, and again, it's hard to talk about 140 countries, but I think if you look at some of the outliers, and particularly in the Middle East and North Africa region, I think you have a combination of two things. One is just inadequate job creation, right? So it's a ration market. And when you have a ration market, and we have evidence from other reports and other sources, that's when networks really matter. Because private sector jobs are very scarce. It's also segmented. They also pay lower. So, so even if you get it, it will not help your mobility much. So I'm caricaturing, but this is kind of the story quite a bit in Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, these are the countries which are outliers. But then you have these rationed, higher-paying jobs where networks matter a lot to get a foothold in the market, to the extent that there is often, sort of multi-generation employment of a family. So which to me is the ultimate sort of indicator of this kind of stickiness, that you get an entry if your father had worked in the public sector. So it's not necessarily ethnicity, but it is something else which makes this. But at the same time, I think that the fundamental problem are, of course, the networks and the outsized influence of the networks. But even more fundamental is just that there is lack of enough job creation and therefore competition among employers for the jobs. Because one thing we have to keep in mind that I think in general it's inefficient to discriminate. And that's why we see in countries like India, there is recent work which has shown that as India has gone through growth and more competition and so on, as it has opened up, discrimination against the scheduled castes and tribes in the labor market have actually reduced over time. Just because even if you leave everything out, I think it's just less profitable if you're discriminating, because an employer wants to reward productivity and so on. So I think the broader point I'm trying to make is that it's the overall health of the labor market which matters a lot, and then there are these influence of networks. These are also very country specific. I'm not that familiar with Colombia, but another country with low income mobility is South Africa, which has again made a lot of improvement in education mobility. And in South Africa, we know it's not an overt discrimination, which is of course outlawed, but there is a historical, sort of a persistence, which I'm sure still matters, as well as where you live, that matters a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think I would stop there.
Just to make it a little bit less comfortable, I think you've both tackled sort of two very obvious labor market barriers, discrimination, overt discrimination, family networks. But you could argue that the other thing that happens in many developing countries, you have very large informal sectors that are not necessarily the result of discrimination or family networks. They are the result of regulations, law, institutions. Sometimes, if you believe Santiago Levy, the result of well-meaning institutions. So he would argue that the proliferation of non-contributory benefits in a place like Mexico create an incentive that maintains informality large. So some of the very same programs that you're trying to use to fight poverty and promote mobility, he would argue are getting in the way of that creation of formal quality jobs where education and income are more tightly linked. You may or not agree with him, But I think the tougher question, and I don't know if any of you want to jump on that one, is, okay, obvious barriers, discrimination, networks, yes, but how do you, that big 100 million question is, how do you actually get developing countries to create more quality jobs, is the question that I think hasn't totally been answered. I'm not sure we're going to answer it on the panel, but Rebecca, you wanted to jump in.
Well, I wanted to jump in. I'll let Ambar answer the question of how you get developing countries to create more, high quality jobs with good pay and life with dignity and maybe benefits. Good luck. But I did want to say a couple things. Like, one, from an educationalist perspective, someone who works in education, it's always heartening and refreshing to have a conversation about what education can do within our sector stops and where we need to link up and work with other sectors. Only because often there is, at least in discourse, if not in policy, this idea that education is a panacea for everything. Education, you just give them more education, there will be better health and wealth, and women will be empowered and there'll be less domestic violence, all of which is true empirically, but it's not like poof, just like that. So I appreciate that. Secondly, I think there is a role that the education sector can play when thinking about how do you better prepare young people for the economies and the opportunities that exist today and the potential avenues that don't exist that they could help create, right? So there's a big focus on entrepreneurship skills, which most of the education systems, again, I'm harping on sub-Saharan Africa because it was such an outlier in your study, most of those education systems are not preparing kids with that at all. And so I often think, in big general terms, because I work on education globally, that education, over the next several decades, education systems face two big twin challenges. The first challenge is addressing what we would call skills inequality, skills or knowledge and competencies, which is what we've talked about, that the current education system, what's on offer for current education systems, are not delivering equally to all kids, which is what your relative mobility shows. Yeah. That really poor kids get a lot less than rich kids, and particularly rural, urban, et cetera. So that's one thing. How do you close that gap in terms of skills inequality? The second big problem, and this is for the rich kids as well as the poor kids in these education systems, is how do you prepare young people for the right skills for the jobs of the future? And that's really sort of skills uncertainty. How do you prepare kids to be able to take in knowledge and information, which is what most education systems are focused on, and use that, have the skills, and to use that knowledge and information in different contexts over their lifetime. And that, having those skills to manipulate and use knowledge and information in different contexts over their lifetime is vastly missing. But I think it's a piece of what we could contribute.
Anna, could I dovetail off of that and
Absolutely.
hopefully raise something
Absolutely.
for conversation? Yeah. One of the things that struck me in the report were the gender differences, which is both, I think, cause for a great deal of celebration and also some concern. So to the extent, at least in the rich countries, that absolute mobility was stagnating, it had a lot to do with the decline of boys. Right, yeah. We saw a very significant increase also in the attainments, however you measure them, absolutely, of women. So talking about, sort of the skills for the future, you wonder which of the groups is sort of best placed to capture that, and whether there might not even be a growing problem if younger boys are in some way become the subject of policy attention as that world of work is changing in many ways, and perhaps women are more positioned even to seize those opportunities. So just
I'm glad you brought that point up, Miles, because I was planning to raise that a little bit later, so I'm glad you brought it up. I think what I'd like to do, if you agree, and I'm going to let Ambar off the hook on the big labor market question, but I would like to start bringing the audience into this conversation, give you all a chance to ask questions. I mean, as the moderator, I'll also take the liberty of throw a few additional questions their way if we're not getting enough questions from the audience. So if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. We'll get you a mic. Please identify yourself. And please, let's try to keep this a conversation, so make it a question and not a long comment followed by no question, if you can. If you want to make comments to the team or the panelists, you can do so after the event, but let's try to make these questions and keep the conversation flowing. If you want a particular panelist to answer your question, please tell us, otherwise I'll give them the choice. So any questions from the audience? You will get a mic right now. Just be a little patient.
So this is on. Good, thanks. So
and please, if you don't mind telling us who you are.
Okay, I'm Steve Crawford. I'm a research professor at George Washington University's Institute of Public Policy, and I'm concerned about the implications of your discussion and findings, especially the report itself, for the debate going on in the United States, because we're struggling with the notion of college for all. There's a growing disillusionment, I think for good reason, with the notion, since in the end only a third of our young people are getting college degrees, but more importantly, there's a huge stratification emerging among college graduates. So those who go to selective colleges do much better, and achieving a BA, which is the kind of measure you use, seems to mask a whole lot of variation among colleges by the quality of them, and also among the majors that students have. So I think probably for a global study that you can't get into those kind of nuances, but we're starting to think more about work-based learning and apprenticeships and the skills that Rebecca's talking about being transmitted. I just wondered if there's more to say about, I think about ingénieur diplômé in France versus kids who went to the public university. Is this an issue as more people get more education that you need to consider?
Let's see if we can keep it going, and then I'll come back to the next question. Yep. Any quick reactions?
I think that is spot on, and I would fit that into this category of improving performance in existing education systems, which would, higher education is kind of a beast in and of itself, can only get us so far. If we're really looking at expanding to either the last mile in the developing world or expanding upwards in places like the US in terms of higher education, and that really we need to think much more innovatively and quite differently about our entire education workforce, who teachers are, who they have supporting them, what constitutes a higher education degree. There's lots of really interesting innovations happening in that space. I just came back from Arizona State University, which has beat out Stanford for the #1 most innovative university in the country, and they're doing all sorts of things with blended learning and higher education and trying to really open up that on-ramp. So I think you're right. That has to be part of the puzzle.
And I'm going to go to another question.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, first of all, I completely agree with what you said, including the fact that in the global report, it's very hard to, we can't really measure these nuances. But one thing to remember is that, which I perhaps should have emphasized more, which is that when we talk about this gap between education mobility and income mobility, some of it is explained by variation in the quality of education. And that's precisely because we're not taking that into account when we are measuring attainment. So what that gap, I'm sure includes is not just the labor market, but it's also the fact that you're not equipped well enough for the labor market, even though you have a BA degree. Yes. So it kind of implicitly comes in, and we do talk about quality a little bit, but not to the extent that we would if we were to do a country or even a regional report. So the point very well taken.
Okay, there was a question back there.
Hi, Shelly Sandoval. I'm an adjunct. Shelly Sandoval. I'm an adjunct at UDC, and I'm a PhD geography student as well. And my question is about language, looking deeply into language and how it fits both into education and the labor force, because it's not just countries, but people also use language for mobility and also for jobs and networking, social mobility. And so I'm thinking, how does your report really, like the methodology of using language as indicators of both labor and education, and even across borders? Because even in the US, we think of us having as one language, but really there's like Native American tribes who also have their indigenous languages that they're using their websites, and they're using technology to keep that going and educating their population. So how we can use languages in education.
more questions?
We'll
or
take,
do
we should have another question. Oh, two. We'll take two and then go back.
Hi, Shawn Martin. I'm a researcher with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I used to work for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, so I understand the relationship between labor markets and mobility. My question is, in your report, and forgive me, I haven't read the overview entirely, but do you account for just cross-border mobility with all these countries? I guess that's my question.
Okay, there's one other question, and then we go back to the panel.
Hi, my name is Elvira. I'm a lawyer in Mexico City, so I would love to hear the answer to our question and your question. Also, regarding innovation, I'd like to hear like 3 specific items about just not innovation or defining innovation, but what
Examples.
3 specific examples could we have? And regarding education policy and employers, I haven't read the report, but I think, I mean, would you believe it should be set as a system? Because education on its own, policy on its own, and employers on its own, like everybody's doing what they think they have to do. We have that in Mexico. As you said, we have a lot of a big informal sector, but we have education, we have public education, but people are not getting jobs at all. I'm not even talking about better jobs. We don't have enough jobs for the people in Mexico, so they can come here. So would this be addressed in your report?
Ambar's report is going to be
Really long.
an encyclopedia at this rate. Ambar or anybody else want to
go
jump
first
in
on the innovation,
responding to
Sure.
the...
So on the question of specific innovations, I'll give you just a couple of quick examples, and if you're interested, I can refer you to more. So one example comes from Brazil, from Amazonas State, which until a couple years ago did not have secondary education for the kids living in Amazonas State. And what and then Brazil passed a law saying every kid needs to have primary and secondary education. That's their right. And so the State Secretary of Education got very creative because the average Amazonas State is largely the Amazon jungle with the capital city, and they had enough trained teachers for secondary school to send a science teacher to every tiny little village. And so what they did is take the teaching profession and split it into 2 types of teachers. They were all teachers, but they had lecturing teachers who were in the capital, Manaus. And then the primary school teachers and others served as sort of facilitating teachers. And they connected the kids with 2-way video uplink. And so now in a couple of years, all kids have access to secondary school. I mean, it's really actually a TV studio where these teachers lecture to 1,000 little classrooms at a time, and they can interact. And that is a much quicker, to me, that's a great leapfrog example. It's a much quicker way to get access to quality secondary school. The learning outcomes seem to be quite on par with the rest of the country, which is quite positive. Then the traditional way of the normal way, where you would build secondary schools, you would wait for several years to train, decade to train secondary teachers, to get them through the pipeline, and then you would deploy them. That would take a long time. So that's a great example. And then there's lots of others I can give you.
I think the language and the migration question might go together. These are both dimensions of human capital, so having language skills, particularly perhaps in English or French or other languages, might facilitate mobility both within and between countries. And I was actually wondering as well, to what extent can we sort of expect that catch-up between rich and poor if there's a good deal of mobility between them, and if some of the most educated or potentially individuals who could get more education move between regions. So the report's great strength is the scope of these 148 countries, but there are also interactions going on here that we should be aware of. Yeah.
Ambar, do you want to join in, or?
No, I think
I have a question that I want to throw to the panel. I mean, I think the policy discussion in the report is quite careful. It talks about equalizing opportunities for individuals, whether we're talking about education or in the labor market or credit markets. It then talks a lot about spatial equalizing spatial chances. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that and your views on that. But then you also make a very big pitch for progressive fiscal policy. And you say you have some strong correlations between the amount of revenues and mobility. This is a nice policy package. Some countries implement those policies and some do not. And having, the U.S. has relatively high tax revenues by global standards, but doesn't do a particularly good job in terms of supporting relative mobility. And I think, Amar, you alluded to it at the end. I mean, the tools are there, but there needs to be a political willingness and political support for using those tools. And you didn't talk a lot about the voice of different parts of society in the political process. And I wanted to ask about the panel in general about that. I mean, to what extent does this lack of mobility or this persistence at the bottom, persistence at the top, to what extent does that in itself pretty much constrain the political process to be responding only to certain voices? And how do you break that? To me, it's almost like you called it a vicious circle where you don't have mobility, so these people don't have voice, or only the top has voice, and then you don't have the policies, even though we all know what should be done. So, just some thoughts on that particular problem, and then I'm going to go back to the audience.
You want to start, Amber? I have plenty of ideas, but I'm
sure. I mean, I'm going to try to stick to the report mainly, and just highlight a few things which I think speak to that. But of course, we don't really directly address the question of why. Why is it that countries with potentially the right set of tools may not be doing that well on mobility? We don't really answer that, but I think there are a few things that are useful to keep in mind. One pattern that we find, which is fairly strong, and that's also supported by a lot of literature from from behavioral experiments and games and so on, which is that in more mobile societies, people tend to be more hopeful about the future of their children, and they tend to be, they're more optimistic about fairness in society. It's not a perfect correlation, but that generally tends to be the case. And there's a whole literature of, the relationship between perceptions of mobility and real mobility. So think about it as three things: actual mobility, perceptions thereof, and then how those perceptions matter for how optimistic people are, and so on. And the reason I mention this is because I think one can draw a connection if you were to believe that actual mobility were to matter for perceptions, at least to some extent, and perceptions matter for how optimistic you are, and therefore how you participate in society. I think that has an implication for how policies are formed and how social consensus can be formed around the kind of policies which will lead to improvements in mobility. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about improvements to mobility, a lot of the things we spoke about, equalization of opportunity, these are long-term things. So you invest in early childhood development today, and we didn't talk about it enough, but some of the most powerful evidence is about intervening really early, and including programs in the United States. Actually, a lot of research is from the United States, and even the Head Start program, with all its faults, there's compelling evidence to show that there are long-term effects. But this is investing in future. And for that, you need a social consensus around those progressive policies, for which mobility matters. So as you rightly say, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. And I see this chicken and egg problem in a way one can frame it as one of having a short horizon versus a longer term horizon. So in the short horizon, if you are very much focused on, if you think society is unfair towards you, I think it's just much harder for a society to get consensus around the policies which are going to make a difference in the long run. And I would stop at that. Of course, there are all these issues about redistribution preferences. I'll leave you with one factoid, which also comes from Alessina and others' recent work. The United States actually is in reality much less mobile than a lot of other high-income countries, but the perceptions of mobility are much higher than many other countries. So actual and perceptions are not all, they don't follow each other. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's one of those conundrums.
I would just add to that, picking up on the United States, that certainly within the education, if you're thinking about sort of education mobility and kids from poor backgrounds being able to get better levels of education than their parents, sort of relative mobility, One of the sort of, just to nuance the dynamic, Amber, you talked about, one of the problems that we face in education is that once parents make it to sort of middle class or higher levels of education, they have much more voice in society, and then they do what a colleague of ours talks a lot about in his recent book, opportunity hoarding, where they sort of orchestrate at the local level how to make sure that their kids and their sisters and brothers' kids and the kids in their community have the same access to good quality schools. And it really is mutually exclusive. Like, you can't sort of have a heterogeneous mixed population and just make sure that all of your kids and your kids who you know get a good quality school. So I think there's a big piece of work to be done around parent demand.
Mm-hmm. Miles,
why don't we've got a room full of questions.
I have a question. Yeah, I see a question right there and another one in the back. Let me start over here with the red stripes.
Thank you. My name's Catherine Craven. I'm a visiting scholar in the politics department at GW and a politics PhD at SOAS, University of London. My question is not so much related to my research, but my sort of personal background and experience. And it's kind of, my question's related to the different valuations of different forms of labor. And it relates a little bit to what the gentleman here was saying earlier. The emphasis on having, a kind of education that prepares students or the labor force for uncertainty and emphasizes innovation and entrepreneurship is all well and good, but we also need, to basically revalue the under-laboring that is required and the kind of apprenticeship-based jobs. And so I come from Germany, a country where with an apprenticeship, you are kind of, valued in society much like someone with an advanced degree. And I know that, for example, also in the Nordic countries, an engineer doesn't necessarily make much more money than someone who has an apprenticeship. And so I wonder whether, we already, we know the answer if we look to the American context, where do we need to look to find the sort of barriers to creating, good jobs. It's the private sector that is, trying to profit rather than actually, pay a decent wage. And so I think this, responsibilizing the private sector and large multinational corporations is important. And maybe you can comment on this. Thank you.
Let's take the other question and then go back to the panel. We are running out of time, so another question, and if there's any more, we'll take one more.
Hi, my name is Jo Marie Griesgraber. I'm with a nonprofit, New Rules for Global Finance, and I want to sort of turn the attention to the World Bank as an instrument and how well you measure how well the World Bank is doing in reducing inequality through education and through early childhood maternal mortality and morbidity, I think it's called. Thank you.
Okay, any more questions? Otherwise, I'm going to turn to the panel to respond to the two questions, but also to offer us any sort of last set of comments that you want to leave the audience with. Let me actually start with Miles and then go that way.
Perhaps I can speak a bit to the question over here and to sort of summarize some of the other conversation. My own view is that intergenerational mobility, at least in earnings, is influenced by three basic institutions: the strength and the role of families, the functioning of the labor market, and the role of the state and public policy and community. And we want families to be strong and to give their children all that they can in life, to give them a good head start. But families have to interact with labor markets. And if there are inequalities embedded in labor markets, that's going to make that voyage upstream much more difficult for some families. And that's the role of the state, to provide progressive supports through redistribution, through insurance, and through human capital investment to permit families in less advantaged situations to see their kids advance. But we should always be concerned about the structure of the labor markets, and if there are embedded in labor markets different types of inequalities, they will cast their shadow onto family experience.
To your question, and it's hard for me to summarize World Bank's work on early childhood development and maternal health and so on. But it certainly it is an important focus for us. It's a part of the Human Capital Project. Is about measuring and rating countries consistently on the basis of certain human development indicators where these things matter. And I don't have the numbers in mind, but we invest a lot in this, and we also do a lot of knowledge work, some of which I'm aware of, more than I'm aware of the projects and so on. So it's very much at the top of our agenda because it fits. And just to have my sort of last word on this a little bit, it fits very well into the narrative of inequality opportunity that we want to talk about, and this report is actually that it is about inequality of opportunity because the way you get intergenerational mobility is by equalizing opportunities. I also wanted to say one thing, which is that in the report we talk a lot about, and this is very deliberate, about progressive policies, and we use the word inequality a lot, not just opportunity, but also inequality of circumstances, because I think sometimes what we forget is that you can reduce inequality of opportunity not just by making sure everybody gets the opportunity, but also by making sure that you do not have so much inequality in the circumstances that people are born in the first place. And there's a balance, of course. One is not talking about doing it to the extent that damages growth and so on. But I think that's one of the points of this report, to focus on both sides of the story. So it's not just about health and education and labor markets, but it's also about the fiscal policy, which reduces extreme inequality. And we talk about property taxes and inheritance taxes and so on, which are not meant to be a prescription for all countries, because it never can be in a global report. But it's something that we hope governments and our institutions and so on will keep in mind as potential options for progressive fiscal policy. And I know IMF shares our views as well, if you look at their recent documents.
And Rebecca?
I guess just a quick response to the question around apprenticeships and why are different jobs valued differently in society, which is a pretty deep question. But one of the things maybe to say is that I do think you're going to see over the next decades a shifting perception around this idea of apprenticeships. I think there's going to be many different models. There's a great model out of South Africa. Again, the scale is very tiny, but where you combine, they have a big job, labor market, pipeline shortage and construction, and it's usually project, foremen and engineers and architects, and they work with kids from really impoverished parts of the country and sort of do a combined secondary school and then go on. And then the company goes on and if they have the right sort of soft skills, the company goes on and pays for their higher education training, and they go back and work in that company for at least 2 years. And there's more and more of these examples, and I think you're going to start seeing a change in perception because of that, because people are going to start, the line between sort of education and higher education is going to blend a little bit more, particularly at secondary level is my prediction. And if you want more examples, I'm happy to share the research with you. We have a book coming out called Leapfrogging Inequality, and we'll launch it on the 21st of May here at Brookings. So there's many, many more examples where that came from.
On
Thanks.
that note, I'd like to thank the panelists, the two presenters, for joining us today. I think I'm no longer in the World Bank, so I can actually say this from outside the bank. I think this is a really important and useful report. I think the work that's gone into compiling that database with all its limitations is phenomenal. Roy wasn't being very modest, but I think he's right. This is a rich source of data that is now going to be available to all researchers to work with. And I think the spotlight and the focus on inequality of opportunity, on economic mobility, is very important and very welcome. I joined the bank in 1990, and the World Bank and the IMF today, and their attention to inequality, the fact that we talk about inequality, their attention to inequality, to poverty, to human capital, and to fairness may not be perfect, but it is a lot better. And it's gone a long way from where it was 25 years ago. And I think that's very, very important. I also, I want to have some optimism. So I look forward to seeing at least absolute mobility improve when we're able to get the next cohorts. I think the world is making a big effort around education, around learning, and around human capital, and I'm hoping that the payoff for that will be a fair chance for children all around the world, and not just in high-income countries with progressive policies today. So thank you all very much. Please join me in a round of applause, and if you want to talk to the presenters, you can grab them as we leave the room. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.